On the day she buried her father, a little girl was thrown into the street with nothing but her teddy bear. Just when the world turned its back, a stranger appeared, and what happened next would change both of their lives forever. Stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that prove kindness can change everything. The morning sky was heavy with a grey so pale it looked like the world had been drained of colour. The bells of St. Mary's tolled faintly in the distance, their echoes trembling through the crisp air. A slow procession of mourners moved past the iron gates of the cemetery, each step weighted with grief. Among them walked a girl, no older than 9, her hands clutching a small teddy bear whose fur was worn thin from years of holding it too tightly. Her name was Claire, and today she stood before the coffin that carried the only parent she had ever truly known, her father. He had been her anchor, her storyteller at night, the one who kissed her forehead when storms rattled the windows. More than that, he had been her promise of safety in a world that already felt too large and unkind. But promises, Claire was learning, could be broken with one cruel twist of fate. The priest's voice faded into the wind as the final prayers were spoken. One by one, shovels of earth struck the wooden lid with dull thuds that echoed like hammers against her chest. Claire's body trembled, her tears soaking the small bear in her arms. The people around her whispered of how cruel life could be, how unfair it was to take a good man so soon. Yet their words carried no comfort. A woman stood only a few steps behind Claire, her face painted with sorrow that seemed convincing to the crowd, but hollow to those who knew her better. Dressed in black, Margaret looked every bit the grieving widow, but inside her eyes burned not grief, but resentment. She had never wanted Claire in her life, had never hidden her disdain for the child who reminded her daily that love once belonged to someone else before her. And now, with the father gone, nothing stood between Margaret and her bitterness. As the ceremony ended, the mourners began to drift away, leaving Claire beside the grave with her damp teddy bear and swollen eyes. Margaret bent low enough for only the girl to hear and said flatly, "You don't belong here anymore." The words sliced through the chilled air like shards of glass. Claire turned her face upward, her lips quivering, but no words came. Her world had already collapsed in silence, and this only deepened the emptiness. The day stretched on, the sun breaking briefly through the clouds as if to mock her despair. Margaret's hand closed around Claire's thin wrist, dragging her toward the large house that had once held laughter and warmth, but now felt like a hollow cavern. Inside, drawers were yanked open, clothes ripped out and stuffed carelessly into an old suitcase. Margaret's movements were brisk, mechanical, as if packing away an unwanted burden. Claire's voice cracked as she whispered, "Please, Mother, forgive me." She didn't know what she had done wrong, but maybe if she begged, maybe if she pleaded hard enough, the woman would change her heart. But Margaret's response was merciless. She carried a bucket of cold water, lifted it without hesitation, and poured it over the child's head. The icy liquid soaked Claire's cream dress, plastering it to her fragile body. Tears and water mingled down her face until it was impossible to know where grief ended and cruelty began. Passers-by on the street slowed their steps. Some whispered in dismay, others turned their faces away, unwilling to involve themselves. A man across the road shook his head sadly before walking off quickly, as though the sight weighed too heavily on his conscience. Margaret pushed the suitcase onto the driveway, its contents spilling open in the dust. She smirked and slammed the door shut, the sound echoing like a final verdict. Claire knelt on the cold ground, dripping wet, clutching her teddy bear as though it was the last piece of her father she had left. The sun was bright overhead, the air alive with summer birdsong, yet for Claire it was the coldest day she had ever known. Just when it seemed the world had abandoned her, a black car pulled to a slow stop at the edge of the driveway. Its door opened with a low click, and out stepped a tall man in a sharp suit. His name was Nathaniel. Known in town only as a successful businessman, he carried a presence that was both commanding and quietly restrained. But it wasn't his wealth that defined him in this moment. It was the look in his eyes softened by a depth of empathy that wealth could never buy. He had been on his way to a meeting when he saw the scene unfold, a child drenched and discarded, her belongings scattered like refuse, and in an instant he was no longer a businessman thinking of contracts and time. He was a boy again, remembering his own nights of loneliness after his mother's death, remembering the sting of rejection from those meant to protect him. Something inside him broke. He moved without hesitation, his polished shoes splashing in the puddle around Claire as he knelt beside her. His suit absorbed the cold water, but he did not care. He placed a firm yet gentle hand on her trembling shoulder. "This ends here," Nathaniel said, his voice carrying a calm authority that stilled the murmurs around them. "No one will ever treat you like this again." Claire lifted her head slowly, her wet lashes parting to see the stranger kneeling beside her. For a fleeting heartbeat she thought it might be her father, alive again to rescue her. But it was Nathaniel, his words hanging in the air like a promise carved in stone. The slam of the front door echoed once more as Margaret stormed outside, her face red with fury. She barked, "She is nothing but a burden. Do you hear me? Nothing. I don't want her." Nathaniel stood, meeting her eyes with an unwavering calm. "If you can abandon her on the day she buries her father," he said evenly, "then you don't deserve to be called her mother. I will take her. From this day forward, she is no longer unwanted." The small crowd that had gathered gasped, their whispers buzzing through the warm air. Margaret froze, her mouth open, but no words came. She knew she could not fight him, not his wealth, not his authority, not the certainty in his voice. With a sharp huff, she turned and retreated inside, slamming the door again. For Claire, that slam no longer meant rejection. It meant release. Nathaniel bent down, carefully picking up her scattered clothes and tucking them back into the suitcase. He lifted the teddy bear from the dust and placed it in Claire's small arms. Then, with a gentleness that surprised even him, he offered his hand. Claire hesitated for a moment, her heart racing. Then she placed her trembling fingers in his palm. Together, they walked toward the car, away from the house that had turned into a prison of cruelty. The crowd dispersed slowly, murmuring among themselves not of pity anymore, but of the strange courage of a man who chose compassion over convenience. Inside the car, Claire sat silently, her small body shivering. Nathaniel drove without speaking at first, giving her the quiet she seemed to need. The city blurred past the windows, but she kept her gaze fixed on the teddy bear in her lap, afraid to look up, afraid that if she blinked he might vanish too. After a long silence, Nathaniel spoke, his voice softer now. "My name is Nathaniel. You don't need to say anything yet. Just know this. You're safe now." Claire didn't answer, but her fingers tightened around the bear. She pressed it to her chest and leaned her head against the seat. For the first time that day, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the coldest day of her life might not last forever. And as the car carried them farther from the House of Shadows, the weight of the future pressed quietly against them both. Neither could know how much their lives were about to change, or how the simple act of kindness on a summer afternoon would ignite a battle neither of them had expected to fight. The road stretched on ahead, long and uncertain, but for Claire, it carried the faintest flicker of hope. The road carried them through quiet neighborhoods and out toward the hills where the houses grew larger and the streets wider. Claire sat motionless in the back seat, her small body pressed against the door, as though distance was the only shield she had left. Nathaniel kept his eyes on the road, giving her silence, understanding that words were too heavy for a child who had lost everything in a single day. When the car finally slowed before tall gates of wrought iron, Claire lifted her eyes in surprise. Behind them stretched an estate she had only ever seen in passing, a sprawling mansion of stone and glass, its windows catching the afternoon sun. The garden beyond the gate was manicured, but it was the kind of beauty that seemed remote, almost unwelcoming to someone carrying a suitcase of old clothes and a bear with missing fur. Nathaniel glanced at her in the mirror. "This is where I live," he said gently. "It's big, I know. Don't be afraid. You're safe here." Claire pressed her teddy closer. She did not answer. The gate swung open and the car rolled up a gravel path to the front entrance. 2 staff members hurried out, but Nathaniel lifted a hand to stop them. "I'll take care of her," he said quietly. They nodded, retreating with curious glances at the soaked little girl stepping out of the car. Inside, the mansion felt vast. High ceilings, polished floors, tall staircases that seemed to stretch forever. For a child who had just left behind a house filled with shadows and cruelty, the sheer size of it felt almost intimidating. Nathaniel noticed her shrinking posture and leaned slightly toward her. "You'll get used to it," he assured her. "And if any room feels too big, you can always stay close to me." He showed her to a guest room. It was furnished simply but warmly, with soft blankets and a small lamp beside the bed. Claire walked in cautiously, her shoes squeaking faintly against the polished wood. She placed her teddy on the pillow and stood still, as though she wasn't sure she was allowed to touch anything else. Nathaniel stood by the door. "This room is yours now," he explained. "No one will move your things without your permission." His tone carried a deliberate firmness, as though he wanted her to believe it beyond doubt. Claire finally spoke, her voice trembling. Why are you helping me?" Nathaniel answered carefully, not wanting to frighten her with the weight of his truth. "Because once, when I was your age, no one helped me. And I promised myself, if I ever saw a child left alone the way I was, I wouldn't look away." Claire blinked at him, uncertain, then turned back to her teddy. She climbed onto the bed, curling into a ball around the bear. Nathaniel stepped out quietly, closing the door halfway to give her space. That night, long after the house had quieted, Nathaniel sat in his study staring at the glow of the desk lamp. Memories he rarely allowed himself to revisit pressed against him. His mother's face, pale in her final days, and his father's voice, cold and distant, calling him a burden. The emptiness of long nights in boarding schools, where children with wealth but no parents traded silence for sleep. He had built his empire stone by stone to bury that pain, but seeing Claire kneeling in the driveway had shattered his defenses in an instant. Upstairs, a cry pierced the silence. Nathaniel rose quickly and made his way to Claire's room. He found her thrashing beneath the blankets, her face twisted in terror. "Papa, don't go," she whimpered in her sleep, clutching the bear as though it were her father's hand. Nathaniel knelt beside her bed. "Hey, it's all right," he said softly, though she could not hear. When she startled awake, eyes wide and wet, she saw him sitting there. "You're safe," he told her. "No one can hurt you here." Claire's lips trembled. "But he's gone," she whispered, her voice almost lost in the dark. Nathaniel reached out slowly, letting her see his hand before he touched her shoulder. "Yes," he said quietly, "but you are not alone. I promise you that." She studied his face for a long moment, searching for a lie. When she found none, she lay back down. Her breathing steadied, though her small hand clutched his sleeve as if afraid he might vanish. Nathaniel remained seated until her breaths turned to the slow rhythm of sleep. When he finally rose and stepped into the hallway, he felt the weight of a new responsibility settle over him. He had spoken a promise he could not break. Downstairs, the night pressed against the glass windows of the mansion. Nathaniel poured himself a glass of water, his reflection staring back at him. He whispered to no one in particular, "This will change everything." And in that moment, the first threads of an unspoken bond had been woven, fragile yet stronger than either of them could have imagined. The stranger who had stopped his car that afternoon was no longer just a passerby. He had stepped into a storm he barely understood, a storm that would soon test the limits of his patience, his compassion, and his past wounds. For now, the mansion was quiet. But beyond its gates, whispers had already begun to spread through the town about the businessman who had taken in the orphan, and not all those whispers carried goodwill. Morning light filtered through the wide curtains of the guest room. Claire opened her eyes slowly, the teddy bear still pressed against her chest. For a brief second, she thought she had dreamed the entire day before, that her father would walk through the door and the smell of his cologne would linger in the air. But reality returned swiftly, heavy and unkind. Downstairs, Nathaniel was already at the breakfast table, a newspaper folded in his hand, untouched. When Claire entered timidly, her hair tangled and her dress wrinkled from sleep, he gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sit, Claire," he said gently. "Eat something. You'll feel stronger." She sat without speaking, her small hands fumbling with the edge of the napkin. A housekeeper placed a plate before her, warm bread and fruit, but Claire only stared. Nathaniel noticed and leaned forward. "If you're not ready, that's all right. Just know there's no rush here. No one will take your food away." Her eyes flickered toward him, uncertain. She picked up a grape, held it between her fingers for a long moment, then finally took a small bite. The sound of the front door slamming echoed suddenly through the hall. A man in a grey suit strode into the dining room, his briefcase snapping open as he spoke. "We need to talk, Nathaniel." His tone was clipped, urgent. Claire shrank back in her chair. Nathaniel rose slowly, his voice calm but firm. "Not now, she's here." The man hesitated, then lowered his voice. "It's Margaret. She's filed a petition. She's demanding custody." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He glanced at Claire, who looked at him with wide, frightened eyes. Then he spoke flatly. "She abandoned her in the street. I won't let her take her back." The lawyer, his name was Alan, shook his head. "Margaret claims it was a misunderstanding. She's arguing you coerced the child. The court has scheduled a preliminary hearing." Claire clutched her teddy bear, whispering almost to herself, "She doesn't want me." Why would she lie? Nathaniel knelt beside her chair, placing a steady hand on her arm. "Because people like Margaret don't care about truth. They care about control. But you don't have to face her alone." The days that followed were filled with tension. Reporters gathered at the gates, shouting questions, snapping photographs of Nathaniel's car. Headlines in the local paper questioned his motives. "Businessman seizes custody of grieving child," one read, while another asked, "Compassion or ambition?" Claire felt their stares when Nathaniel drove her to school. Children whispered, some with sympathy, others with cruel curiosity. At recess she sat apart, sketching shapes in the dirt with a stick. One afternoon, a soft voice interrupted her solitude. "Can I sit here?" A tall woman with dark hair, dressed neatly in a navy suit, stood beside her. She introduced herself. "My name is Isabel. I'm a lawyer. Nathaniel asked me to help." Claire looked down at her shoes, not answering. Isabel sat on the bench anyway, leaving a respectful distance. "I know it's hard to trust strangers," she said gently, "but I want you to know something. My job is to protect you. No one is allowed to hurt you anymore." Claire raised her eyes for a moment. "But what if the judge believes her?" she asked softly. Isabel paused, then replied, "Judges listen to more than words. They look for truth. And I think you carry the truth in your eyes, Claire." That evening, Nathaniel and Isabel spoke in the study, their voices low but urgent. Nathaniel said, "Margaret only wants her because of the inheritance. She sees Claire as a ticket to money she doesn't deserve." Isabel nodded. "We can argue that, but the court will still want to test the situation. They may order a temporary stay with Margaret to evaluate the environment." Nathaniel's fist clenched around the armrest. "I won't let her go back there." Isabel looked at him steadily. "We may not have a choice, not at first. But if she mistreats Claire again, the court will see it. Sometimes the hardest way is the only way to prove the truth." The night before the hearing, Claire woke from another nightmare. She ran down the hall and pushed open Nathaniel's door, her face pale and wet with tears. "Please don't make me go back," she whispered. Nathaniel pulled her close, his voice breaking with quiet intensity. "I don't want you to, Claire. But if they send you there, only for a short while, I will be here every moment waiting for you, I swear it." She buried her face in his chest. "Promise?" "Yes," Nathaniel said flatly. "Promise." The courtroom was cold and formal. Margaret sat across the aisle, her black dress tailored to perfection, her eyes shimmering with false sorrow. She spoke to the judge in a tone drenched with performance. "Your Honor, I loved Claire as my own, but grief makes people act in strange ways. I only want her home again." Claire sat silently beside Isabel, her small hands folded, her teddy bear hidden beneath the table. Nathaniel's gaze never left her. The judge studied the case file, then looked down from the bench. Given the circumstances, the court orders that the child spend 1 week in her stepmother's custody under supervision. Afterward, this court will review the situation. The gavel struck once, final and sharp. Claire's heart dropped. She looked at Nathaniel, panic rising in her chest. He leaned close, whispering so only she could hear, "It's only 1 week. Hold on to that. Just 1 week." Tears welled in her eyes, but she nodded faintly, gripping the teddy bear tighter. As Margaret's smile curved into triumph, Nathaniel's eyes hardened. He had given Claire his word, and he knew keeping it would soon demand more of him than he had ever imagined. The car ride back to Margaret's house felt longer than it ever had. Claire sat in the back seat beside a court-appointed escort, her teddy bear clutched tightly in her lap, the fabric damp from the way she held it to her chest. Outside, the city blurred past, the trees and buildings all looking the same. She stared out the window without blinking, afraid that if she closed her eyes she might not have the courage to open them again. Margaret was already standing at the doorway when the car pulled into the driveway. She had dressed in a pale blue dress this time, softer than black, her hair pinned neatly, her smile measured and polite. To the escort, she said warmly, "Thank you so much for bringing her back. I was so worried." Claire stepped out of the car slowly, her shoes sinking slightly into the gravel. She kept her eyes down. Margaret bent slightly, placing a hand on Claire's shoulder. "Welcome home, darling," she said in a tone so sweet it made Claire feel sick. Inside, the house looked different. The curtains were drawn back, sunlight streamed across polished floors, and fresh flowers stood in a vase on the dining table. But beneath the surface, the air still carried the same chill. The escort took a quick tour through the rooms, noting everything down on a clipboard. Margaret served tea and biscuits, playing the part of the concerned stepmother with practiced grace. When the escort finally left, closing the door behind her, Margaret's smile evaporated. Her voice dropped into a cold whisper. "Do not speak unless spoken to. Do you understand?" Claire nodded faintly. "Good," Margaret continued. "You made a fool of me in front of the whole town. Now you will behave, or I will make sure that judge never lets you go back to that man." That night, dinner was a plate of plain rice and water. Margaret sat across the table with her glass of wine, watching Claire silently. "You'll eat every grain," she said quietly, "or you'll go to bed hungry." Claire chewed slowly, her eyes never lifting from the plate. The days passed with similar cruelty. Margaret smiled in front of the social worker, who visited once, but once the door closed, her face hardened. She found small ways to punish Claire, removing her blanket at night, locking the bathroom door so she had to ask permission to use it, hiding her teddy bear for hours at a time. Still, Claire remained silent. She remembered Nathaniel's words, "Just 1 week." She counted the days on the inside of her closet door with a piece of chalk she found in the corner, each line a quiet promise to herself. One afternoon, while Margaret was out, Claire sat at the kitchen table with a scrap of paper. She wrote a letter in careful block letters. "Dear Nathaniel, I miss you. Please don't forget me. I am being good. I am waiting." She folded it and tucked it into the lining of her bear's back seam, the only place Margaret would not look. But Margaret returned earlier than expected. She noticed the paper still on the table, another one Claire had begun before hiding the first. "What is this?" she asked sharply, snatching it up. Claire stammered, It's just a letter." "To whom?" Margaret's voice rose. "To that man? You think you can run back to him?" When Claire didn't answer, Margaret grabbed her by the arm and dragged her down the hallway. She opened the door to the basement, dark and musty, and shoved her inside. "You will stay here until you remember who you belong to," she said flatly, slamming the door behind her. The room smelled of dust and old wood. Claire sat on the cold floor, hugging her teddy bear, rocking back and forth to keep from crying too loudly. The darkness pressed in around her, but she whispered to the bear, "Just a few more days. Just a few." Meanwhile, in Nathaniel's study, A neighbor who lived across from Margaret's house stood before him, his hat in his hands. "I didn't want to get involved," the man admitted nervously, "but I saw her drag the girl into the basement. I think something's wrong." Nathaniel rose from his chair at once. His voice was calm but full of steel. "Thank you. That's all I needed to hear." He called Isabel immediately. "We're done waiting," he said. "We're going to get her out of there tonight." Isabel met him at the courthouse with emergency papers in hand. They obtained a temporary order to remove Claire from the house pending investigation. Nathaniel didn't waste a second. The car screeched to a stop in Margaret's driveway just after sunset. 2 officers stepped out behind Nathaniel and approached the door. Margaret opened it, feigning surprise. "What's the meaning of this?" she demanded. Nathaniel's voice was quiet but firm. "Where is she?" Margaret tried to protest, but the officers moved past her. They opened the basement door and found Claire curled up on the floor, clutching her bear. Her face was pale, her eyes red and tired. When she saw Nathaniel, she froze for a moment, afraid she was dreaming. Then she whispered, "You came." Nathaniel stepped into the room, his shoes crunching on the dirt floor. "Of course I came," he said softly. "I told you I would." He lifted her into his arms, the teddy bear still pressed between them. Claire wrapped her arms around his neck and buried her face in his collar. Margaret stood in the hallway, her expression sour with defeat. One of the officers handed her the court order. She didn't read it. She simply turned away. As they walked out into the night, Claire held on to Nathaniel as tightly as she could. The streetlights glowed softly overhead, casting their shadows long on the pavement. In the car, Nathaniel didn't speak for a while. He let Claire rest her head on his lap, her eyes fluttering closed, her fingers tangled in the bear's ear. When she finally whispered, "I thought maybe you forgot," he answered gently, "I never forget promises, Claire. Not ever." She closed her eyes again, this time not in fear but in the fragile safety of being found. The house they left behind grew smaller in the distance. Ahead of them, the road wound toward a different kind of future. But Nathaniel knew that what had just happened was only the beginning. The wounds Margaret had reopened would take time to heal. And though Claire was now out of danger, the shadows of what had been done to her would not disappear overnight. He looked down at her small face, peaceful in sleep, and whispered quietly to himself, "Now, the real work begins." The night after Claire was brought back to Nathaniel's home, the air in the mansion felt different. The staff moved more quietly, their glances heavy with sympathy, as they looked at the girl who now clung to her teddy bear as if it were her last shield. Nathaniel carried her suitcase upstairs himself, unwilling to let anyone else touch it. He set it down in the same guest room she had slept in before, but this time he knelt in front of her at the doorway and spoke carefully. "You will never go back there again," he said flatly. Claire studied his face, searching for the same steadiness she had seen in the courtroom. Her voice trembled. "Even if she asks the judge again?" Nathaniel answered firmly. "Even then. The judge saw what she did. And now she has lost her chance." She nodded faintly, stepping into the room. But later, when the house grew quiet and the lights dimmed, her sobs reached down the hall. Nathaniel went in, sitting by her bedside. She whispered, "I tried to be good. I didn't want you to think I wasn't trying." Nathaniel placed a hand over hers. "You don't have to earn my care, Claire. It's not about being good. It's about being you." She closed her eyes, clutching the bear, and for the first time, the tremors in her chest slowed until sleep finally took her. The following morning, news of Margaret's arrest spread through the town. The papers printed bold headlines. "Stepmother charged with neglect and abuse." Neighbors who had once turned away from the sight of Claire on the driveway now shook their heads in shame, some confessing in hushed voices that they should have spoken sooner. Nathaniel ignored the chatter. His focus was on Claire. He hired a doctor to check her health, ensuring the week of deprivation had left no lasting damage. He also arranged for a counselor to visit the house, though he stayed nearby during the first session. Claire sat stiffly at first, arms folded around her bear, But as the counselor spoke gently, her shoulders relaxed. Later that day, Isabel arrived with stacks of legal papers. She placed them on Nathaniel's desk and said, "The case is strong now. The court cannot return her to Margaret. But you should know there will still be hearings. Margaret will fight. People like her always do." Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, his voice calm. "Let her fight. I will fight harder." Isabel studied him for a long moment, then said quietly, "You've changed since the day I first met you. It's not just about duty for you anymore." Nathaniel glanced toward the staircase, where Claire's laughter, fragile but real, echoed faintly. "It never was about duty," he said softly. That evening, Claire joined Nathaniel for dinner in the grand dining room. The chandelier glowed above them, casting warm light across the table. She poked at the food with her fork before speaking timidly. "May I ask something?" Nathaniel nodded. "Of course. Why did you come for me?" she asked. He placed his fork down, his gaze steady. "Because no one came for me when I was your age. And I swore, if I ever saw a child left alone like that, I wouldn't turn away." Her lips trembled. "But what if you get tired of me?" Nathaniel's answer was immediate. "I won't. You're safe here. That's the end of it." The certainty in his tone calmed her, and for the first time in many days she took a full bite of food. But peace never lasted long. 1 week later, as the case built toward its next stage, Margaret posted bail. She stepped out of the courthouse surrounded by cameras, her lips curved in a smile that was more venom than charm. Reporters rushed forward, and she raised her chin, declaring, "I will not rest until my daughter is returned to me. This man has stolen her from me." Nathaniel watched the broadcast on the evening news. Claire, sitting beside him on the couch, covered her ears as Margaret's voice filled the room. Nathaniel switched off the television at once. "She won't come near you again," he said firmly. Still, Margaret's words lingered like a shadow. Claire dreamed that night of being dragged once more into the cold basement, her cries muffled in the dark. She woke, screaming, clutching at the sheets. Nathaniel rushed into the room and held her until the tremors faded. She whispered through tears, "I thought maybe you wouldn't come this time." He pulled her close, speaking quietly against her hair. "I will always come." From that night on, Nathaniel began reading to her before bed. It was something simple, but each story seemed to knit the broken edges of her trust. He sat beside her lamp, his voice low, and when she drifted into sleep, he would remain until her breathing steadied. Meanwhile, Isabel worked tirelessly. She gathered witness statements from neighbors, photographs of the bruises on Claire's arms where Margaret had grabbed her, and even the chalk marks Claire had drawn in the closet to count the days. Every detail built the case higher until Margaret's chances grew slimmer by the hour. Yet the threat remained. Margaret had money of her own, and more importantly, a talent for twisting appearances. Nathaniel knew she would not disappear quietly. One afternoon, he walked with Claire in the garden. She held his hand loosely, her eyes watching the roses along the path. After a long silence, she said, "When I was in the basement, I told myself you would come. I wasn't sure, but I told myself over and over." Nathaniel looked down at her, his voice firm. "Then hold on to that. No matter what she says, no matter what happens in court, remember, I will come." She nodded, her grip on his hand tightening. As they walked back toward the mansion, the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and red. The air felt heavy with the weight of battles yet to come. Margaret was free, and Nathaniel knew she would strike again. But in that moment, as Claire leaned against him, he also knew something else. The rescue was not finished simply because she was home. The true rescue, the rescue of her trust, her laughter, and her childhood, was only just beginning. The days that followed Margaret's release carried a tension that never fully lifted. Though the mansion stood as a fortress with guards at the gate, Nathaniel knew safety was never absolute. He spent more hours at home than he had in years, rearranging his business schedule so he could be near Claire. The empire he had built suddenly mattered less than the fragile child who followed him with wary eyes, as though afraid he might vanish. Each morning, Nathaniel sat with her at breakfast. He made sure her plate was full, but he never insisted. One morning when she hesitated to eat, he spoke softly. "Food will never be taken from you here," he said flatly. "Eat when you're ready." Claire looked at him, searching his face, then picked up her fork. It was a small gesture, but Nathaniel saw the victory in it. To help her heal, he brought in a tutor who specialized in children who had experienced trauma. Claire resisted at first, her voice tight. "I don't want lessons. I only want quiet." The tutor replied gently, "That's all right, we can read stories instead, no pressure." Over time, Claire began to sit with the tutor, her small hands tracing letters across the page. She stumbled over words, but her determination grew. Nathaniel often watched from the doorway, pride swelling in his chest. But healing was not linear. At night, the house still echoed with Claire's cries. Sometimes she woke calling for her father, other times shaking from memories of the basement. Nathaniel made it his habit to be there, sitting beside her bed until her breathing slowed. One night, after a particularly harsh nightmare, she clung to his sleeve and whispered, "Don't leave me, Papa." The word caught him by surprise. For a long moment, he could not move. Then, quietly, he answered, "I'm here." The next morning, Claire acted as though she had not said it, but Nathaniel carried the moment with him, a weight that was both tender and solemn. Meanwhile, Isabel became a frequent presence at the mansion. She came to discuss the case, her arms full of files, but soon she found herself staying for dinner or walking with Claire in the gardens. Claire took to her quickly, asking questions in her soft voice. "Were you scared when you were little? Did anyone ever make you afraid?" Isabel knelt to meet her eyes. "Yes," she admitted, "but I learned something. Fear is loud, but it can't last forever. Hope is quieter, but it doesn't go away." Nathaniel watched these exchanges with gratitude. Isabel carried a calmness he could not always offer. One evening, after Claire had gone to bed, he thanked her. "You've done more for her than you realize." Isabel smiled faintly. "And what about you? You've given her something most children take for granted, a place where they belong." Their eyes lingered a moment longer than necessary before Nathaniel looked away. He had spent years avoiding attachments, but now, between Claire's quiet trust and Isabel's steady presence, he felt walls shifting inside him that he had sworn would never move again. Still, Margaret's shadow loomed. She gave interviews to the press, speaking with practiced grief. "That child is mine," she insisted to the cameras. "He has manipulated her. He has turned her against me." The reporters spread her words, fueling gossip across the town. Some believed her, others condemned her, but all of it found its way back to Claire. She overheard whispers at school, children repeating what their parents had said at dinner tables. One boy taunted her in the hallway. "You're just baggage. He doesn't want you either." Claire ran to the bathroom and locked herself inside. Nathaniel arrived minutes later, called by the school. He tapped gently on the door. "It's me," he said quietly. Her voice was broken. "Why does everyone hate me?" Nathaniel leaned his forehead against the door. "Not everyone. Not me. Not Isabel. And the ones who whisper. They don't know the truth." After a long silence, the door opened a crack. Claire stepped out, her eyes swollen. Nathaniel crouched so she could see his face clearly. "You are wanted," he said flatly. "Never doubt that." Back at the mansion, life settled into a new rhythm. Nathaniel read to her every night. Isabel taught her small lessons about resilience, and slowly, laughter returned to the halls. It was tentative at first, like the timid notes of a bird after winter, but it grew stronger. One afternoon in the garden, Claire laughed so freely that the gardener paused in his work to listen. Nathaniel, watching from the terrace, felt something stir in his chest. He turned to Isabel, who stood beside him, and said softly, "She's starting to heal." Isabel replied, "So are you." For a moment, their eyes met again, and the silence between them carried more than words. But the peace was fragile. Nathaniel knew Margaret was waiting, building her plans, sharpening her lies. The battle was far from over. Yet as the sun dipped behind the hills and Claire ran through the garden with her teddy bear in hand, He understood something deeper. Whatever storms came, they would face them, not as strangers bound by chance, but as a family being forged through fire. Summer's calm did not last. Margaret's presence returned like a gathering cloud, darkening every corner of Nathaniel's peace. Released on bail, she wasted no time in fueling gossip. She appeared on local television, her voice trembling with feigned sorrow. "I only want to be reunited with my daughter," she told reporters. "He has stolen her from me. He twists her mind against me." Claire sat on the sofa in Nathaniel's study as the broadcast played. Her small hands gripped the arms of the chair, her face pale. Nathaniel turned off the television at once. "Don't listen to her," he said flatly. Claire's voice was barely audible. "What if the judge listens?" Nathaniel knelt beside her, meeting her eyes. "Then I will speak louder. I will not let her take you." The weeks that followed grew heavier with threats. Margaret's lawyers filed motion after motion, trying to stall the process. Anonymous letters appeared at Nathaniel's gate, filled with accusations meant to tarnish his name. At dinner one evening, Isabel looked up from a stack of documents and said quietly, "She's not fighting for Claire. She's fighting for control, and she's running out of weapons." Nathaniel asked, "Then why does it feel like she's still winning?" Isabel answered, "Because she knows where to strike. She knows fear is her greatest ally." Fear did indeed creep back into Claire's nights. She dreamed of Margaret standing in the doorway, calling her name, pulling her away from Nathaniel's arms. Some mornings she refused to leave her bed, whispering to her teddy bear, "She'll come for me again." Nathaniel decided he would not allow fear to rule the house. He spent more hours with Claire, taking her into town, walking with her along the park paths. Some people stared, some whispered, but others nodded respectfully, beginning to see the truth. Compassion was replacing doubt, one witness at a time, yet Margaret was not finished. One rainy afternoon, as thunder rolled across the hills, Claire was walking home from school with a driver from Nathaniel's household. At a corner where the road narrowed, a dark car pulled up alongside. Margaret stepped out, her umbrella snapping open, her face set in a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Claire," she called, her voice syrupy sweet. "Come with me, darling. Let me take you home." The driver stepped forward immediately. "Stay back, Mum," he warned. But Margaret's words sliced through the storm. "You don't belong with him. He is not your father. You're mine." Claire froze, the rain soaking her hair, her chest heaving as fear rooted her to the spot. The driver tried to guide her back toward the car, but Margaret lunged, grabbing Claire's arm. In that instant, another car screeched to a halt beside them. Nathaniel stepped out, his coat whipping in the wind, his voice sharp as thunder. "Let her go." Margaret's grip tightened. "She is my daughter," she shouted over the rain. Nathaniel moved closer, his eyes locked on hers. "A mother does not abandon her child in the street," he said flatly. "A mother does not lock her in the dark. You lost that title the day you chose cruelty over care." For a moment, the storm seemed to hold its breath. Margaret's face twisted in rage. But the police, alerted by a bystander who had called, arrived in seconds. Officers pulled her back, her umbrella collapsing in the wind as she screamed. Claire stumbled into Nathaniel's arms, her body trembling. "You came," she whispered through the rain. "I will always come," Nathaniel answered firmly, holding her close. The officers restrained Margaret, placing her in the back of their car. Her shouts faded as the door slammed shut. Claire clung tighter to Nathaniel, her tears lost in the downpour. Later, back at the mansion, the storm still roared outside, lightning flashing across the windows. Isabel sat with them in the living room, her voice steady as she spoke. "This changes everything. The court cannot ignore this. She will face charges, not just accusations." Claire curled against Nathaniel's side, exhausted but unwilling to let go. Nathaniel stroked her hair slowly, his gaze fixed on the fire crackling in the hearth. "Then it ends here," he said quietly. "It has to." But Isabel studied him carefully. "For her, maybe. But for you, Nathaniel, storms like this leave scars. Are you ready to carry them?" He met her eyes across the glow of the fire. If it means she can sleep without fear, then yes, every scar is worth it. Outside, the storm began to fade, but the echoes of thunder lingered. For Claire, the night had been her darkest yet, but also the clearest proof that she was not alone. And for Nathaniel, the battle had sharpened his resolve into something unbreakable. What lay ahead would test them again, but in that moment, with the rain sliding down the glass and Claire's small hand clutching his sleeve, Nathaniel knew that the storm had not destroyed them. It had bound them closer than ever before. The morning after the storm, the mansion felt different. The heavy air of waiting, the constant fear that Margaret might appear at any corner, had lifted. News spread quickly through the town. Margaret had been arrested after the incident in the rain, facing charges of neglect, abuse, and attempted abduction. For the first time, Nathaniel could breathe without looking over his shoulder. Still, he knew the fight wasn't only in courtrooms. Healing was its own kind of battle. He found Claire in the garden that morning, sitting quietly on the stone bench, her teddy bear balanced on her knees. The roses around her glistened with dew. Nathaniel sat beside her, leaving a respectful silence before speaking. "She won't come back," he said flatly. Claire's eyes stayed on the teddy bear. "They always said she was my mother, but mothers don't hate their children, do they?" Nathaniel answered carefully, his voice low. "A mother is not defined by words or papers. A mother is defined by love. If she cannot give love, she cannot hold the title." Claire turned to him then, her face searching his. "So what am I now?" "You are a child who belongs," Nathaniel replied, "and you always will." In the weeks that followed, the courts moved swiftly. With Isabel's evidence, witness statements, medical reports, and the testimony of neighbors, the judge granted Nathaniel permanent custody. Margaret's last attempt to appeal was dismissed. She would spend her future far from the town, her name spoken in whispers as a cautionary tale. The mansion transformed with time. The halls, once silent, echoed with Claire's footsteps, her laughter tentative but growing stronger. Nathaniel read to her each night, and Isabel became a steady figure at their table. One evening, Claire looked at Isabel across the plates of food and asked, "Will you stay even when the papers are finished?" Isabel smiled gently. "Yes, Claire, I will stay as long as you want me to." Nathaniel, watching the exchange, felt a warmth he hadn't expected. He had thought his life was complete with business and success, but now he realized it had been hollow. In Isabel's steady eyes and Claire's fragile trust, he found something he hadn't dared hope for: family. Months later, on a bright spring afternoon, Nathaniel drove with Claire and Isabel to the cemetery. The air was soft with birdsong, the trees full of new leaves. Claire carried a small bouquet of daisies in her hands. She walked slowly to her father's grave, kneeling to place the flowers on the stone. For a moment she was silent. Then she whispered, "Papa, you don't have to worry anymore. I'm safe now. He came for me, just like you always did. I'm not alone." Nathaniel stood a few steps behind, giving her space, his hands folded in front of him. Isabel stood beside him, quiet and respectful. Claire turned and ran back to them, her dress fluttering in the breeze. She slipped her hand into Nathaniel's and looked up at him. "Can we go home now?" Nathaniel smiled faintly. "Yes, Claire, let's go home." They walked back together, three figures framed by sunlight. For Claire, the word home no longer meant the mansion or its walls. It meant Nathaniel's steady voice, Isabel's gentle presence, and the promise that love could grow even after everything else had been broken. As the sun began to set, casting gold across the hills, Claire leaned against Nathaniel's side and whispered, "Thank you for finding me." Nathaniel's voice was calm, but certain as he answered, "It was never chance, Claire. Some bonds are meant to be found." And so the long road from grief to healing came to rest, not with silence but with the laughter of a child who had learned to trust again, and the quiet strength of those who refused to let her fall. The storm had ended, and in its place rose a new dawn. And so from pain and rejection came a story of hope, proving that family is not only the one we are born into, but also the one we find when love steps in. If this story touched you, don't forget to like this video. Leave a comment sharing what kindness means to you, and subscribe to our channel so we can bring you more stories that inspire and heal.